In this module, we're going to talk about association and causality. A lot of this material is based off of chapter 6 in your textbook, so please make sure that you read that chapter before starting this module so you have a basic understanding of some of the concepts that we're going to be covering. In the last module, we did a review of the different study designs that exist in epidemiological research. We talked about how some study designs are stronger than other study designs. For example, a cohort study is going to be a much stronger study design than something like a cross-sectional study or even a case series or case report. So while the strength of the studies varies, you will often hear in different textbooks or maybe in your classes that it's experimental studies, so things like randomized control trials, that are the study designs that allow us to establish causality. While that's technically true, not all exposure outcome relationships can be examined through a randomized control trial. So if you think, for example, of something like smoking and lung cancer, it's not really possible for us to ever really assign people randomly to a smoking group versus a non-smoking group. And so randomized controlled trials really aren't in the works for studying something like smoking and lung cancer. So we can't always use RCTs, so we often have to rely on observational studies. When we're conducting epidemiological research, what we're typically trying to understand is what is the relationship between some independent variable or some exposure variable. Remember, your independent variable is always going to be that risk factor or that exposure that you're looking at, and the relationship with your outcome or your dependent variable. You should know these terms, independent and dependent variable. They will be used throughout the course, and they're just basic terms that you should understand. So when we're talking about our exposure, we're talking about our independent variable. When we're talking about the outcome of interest, the disease, whatever that outcome is, that is going to be our dependent variable. So I gave an example of smoking and lung cancer. Another example I might be interested in looking at is physical activity as an independent variable and heart disease as my dependent variable. But at the end of the day, regardless of what variables you're looking at, you are trying to understand what this relationship looks like, and we're often trying to understand causal relationships. So does my independent variable actually cause my dependent variable? This is often a difficult question to answer. So far, we've talked about study designs, and we've talked about the measures of association that we use in different study designs. So for example, in a case control study, I would use an odds ratio. In a cohort study, I would use a relative risk. Let's say that I found an odds ratio greater than 1. Does that necessarily mean that I've found a causal relationship between my independent and my dependent variable? Not necessarily. Establishing a causal relationship versus an association, this is actually a very complex and difficult thing to do. So in this module, we are going to spend some time talking about how we go about establishing causal relationships in epidemiology and what are some of the criteria that we can use, because just because we see an association does not mean that that association is a causal association.